He is a professor of architecture and cultural history at Princeton University. And Tony has been involved in the center, I think, of the discussion about architecture and the criticism of architecture for the last 20 years, both at Princeton University and as one of the early and longtime editors of Oppositions, the journal. He's currently just about to release 2 books that I think have been long waited for, since they focus on the area of his concern. One through MIT Press on the architecture of Viollet-le-Duc, and the other by Princeton University Press on the architecture of the 18th century, a general history called The Writing on the Wall. Tony, in the center of the discussion, I think, for the last 20 years, has also had the perspective to see the edges of the discussion, to see the realm and the arena that architects are operating in. He's one of the few critics, I think, in the country who asks questions of conscience. His area of expertise, as we'll probably see tonight, and as the books will reveal, has been on the particular dilemmas of architectural thinking and history since the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. And I think that Tony looks at this area not from the point of view as a historian for its relevance in a past cultural sense, but because they're absolutely vital in the making and discussion of architecture today. So he positions himself and our discussions in the continuum of that debate over the last 2.5 centuries. So I'll give you Tony Vidler.
Thank you, Ron. A pointer. Yeah. 2 things. When Ron was at Princeton, I always thought he was just too tall. But I got over it, and he did too. And secondly, this arose out of a couple of months ago I met Becky Binder and confessed that in 21 years in the States I'd been to Fayetteville, Arkansas, I'd been to Houston, I'd even been to Florida, but I'd never been to LA. And she said, why haven't you been to LA? I said, nobody's invited me. So I think this is the very best way to come to LA, in a school that has always professed to be in some way lively, anti-academic in a creative and tough sense, and I feel at home here, and I hope that you'll bear with me for these few minutes as I begin to talk about something that I think has become overbearingly a problem for my generation and for all of you too, I think. That is something that when, at the end of the 19th century, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche turned to his academic colleagues and found them wanting, termed the uses and disadvantages of history for everyday life. And he concluded, we're all suffering from a consuming fever of history. This could have been written not in the 1870s, but in the 1980s, I think. We're all suffering from a consuming fever of history, and ought at least to recognize that we are suffering from it, and it is, after all, an illness. And so what I would like to do tonight is to somehow draw a pathology of this illness, of a kind of what Nietzsche called a degree of sleeplessness, self-conscious rumination that he characterized the historical sense, which is harmful and ultimately fatal to the living thing. Now, don't forget, this is a historian telling you this, so you have to be skeptical of my agenda as well as Nietzsche's. But Nietzsche, as he finished this essay, said that it was his effort to determine this degree and where the boundary at which the past has to be forgotten if it's not to become the grave digger of the present. So what I would like to do tonight is to talk a little bit about the past as it has been the gravedigger of the present, the emerging sensibility for history, which we now understand as the development of historicism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the recurrence of the same, which I shall get to towards the end of the lecture, posing a few paradoxes. Could we have the first two slides, please? Do I just press? On the screen you see two images of the Venice that isn't in California. On the right, the Campanile of Venice in June 1902, and on the left, the Campanile of Venice on the 14th of July 1902. As you can see, it is in the process of falling down. And there, as you can see, it has fallen. It hadn't done it before, and it posed a great problem both to Venice and to the cultural world at large. Standing in various guises on the same spot since the 11th century, a religious and secular rallying point for the Venetian Republic for centuries, this monument had taken on a symbolic character from Bellini to Canaletto that stood virtually for Venice herself. And it was now reduced in the space of a few minutes to a pile of rubble. What was to be done? Should the event simply be accepted as an inevitable consequence of history in the hand of time? Should the monument, an instrument of memory, be allowed to fade into the realm of memory without physical trace? Or should it immediately be rebuilt on firmer foundations and with modern technology, but with the exact outer guise of the old tower? Should, that is, a space be left vacantly symbolizing the passing of time, and even the greatest and most permanent of monuments? Or should this unfortunate reminder of temporal accidents be covered over hastily, like a tear in the wallpaper, so that what was only a temporary discontinuity in the history of the monument be consigned, if possible, to oblivion? The London Daily Telegraph, in a quotation dug up by Colin Rowe and reprinted in that wonderful issue of Oppositions edited by Kurt Foster, the London Daily Telegraph was explicit. The charm of the Campanile of St. Mark's, I presume the reporter spoke roughly like that, was the stern and imposing beauty of proportion and of strength. It has fallen, with all the associations that have clustered around it so long, and it may be fervently hoped that no civic zeal for restoration will ever lead a Venetian prefect to try and build it up again. Its memories are safe upon the canvases of Canaletto. That before recent studies in restoration have found the canvases of Canaletto to be entirely unsafe. Its proportions are enshrined in every architectural textbook in the world, but the grace its builders gave it is lost forever with the art they knew. The opposite view, as we know, prevailed, and very soon there seemed to be no visible rupture in the skyline. Of two other possible courses of action in 1902, nothing was heard. That there might be a possibility of partially conserving that fragment of the basin of Sansovino's Loggetta, which remained beneath the rubble, conserving, that is, the ruins of the tower as a kind of significant ruin in the center of Venice, was hardly discussed. And certainly no one dared to suggest, with the optimism that was to become the leitmotif of modernism some few years later, that a modern architect might be called on to design a new tower, symbol of modern Venice, in its stead. Nobody had yet invented the Biennale. The Campanile was either considered a precious relic of a distant past, whose demise was to be mourned, but whose fabric was literally irretrievable. You couldn't call up the ancient masons to do their work again. Or else it was a living monument, too precious to the very idea of Venice to be so lightly dispensed with. This dilemma between historical irreplaceability and monumental necessity is the large theme of my talk tonight. And I'll approach it by quite simply inquiring as to how, and more especially when, such a dilemma arose. That is, why and in what circumstances did the notion of historical become attached to the idea of the monumental, in order to invent that very difficult and quite modern hybrid known only too casually today as the historical monument. For while monuments have been around since the beginning of culture, historical monuments, objects invested with value precisely because of their age and historical associations, have been with us for only a relatively short time, since that is the emergence of a sense of history, of the past as valuable in and for itself. The example of the Campanile is again instructive. That's more of the rubble on the right. As built, the Campanile was an object of use. The bells summoned the congregation to prayer or warned them in time of danger, while the height of the tower acted as a landmark for the fleet at sea. Supplementing this use value, its position beside the Church of St. Mark's as a ducal chapel and repository of the body of Venice's patron saint endowed it with a monumental and symbolic value that increased over the centuries. But its architecture, that of most late 11th and 12th century campaniles, was itself not considered to be of any great significance. When repairs were needed, they were carried out. And when, in the 16th century, a passion for antiquity had rendered the Byzantine and medieval periods virtually invisible with regards to their artistic or aesthetic value, the monumental status of the Campanile had to be invented, first by the capping that Ivoine put on it in 1511, and then by the application of the Loggetta of Sansovino, which had the effect of turning the entrance of the Campanile into an antique triumphal arch. It was, of course, Sansovino who also disengaged the Campanile from its attachment to the old Procurate Vecchie, thus making it a separate and freestanding monument in its own right, establishing it thus as part of an ensemble of monuments invested with political signification, the self-conscious beginning of the Venetian myth of the Republic. The Loggetta seems to be here more important than the Campanile itself, completing as it did the new forum with the mint, the library, and the ducal palace that surrounded this political center with the administrative and symbolic monuments of the Venetian Republic. But it was not until the fall of this republic and the gradual rise of historical studies following Ruskin. I give you Canaletto's famous view of the Campanile and St. Mark's on the left, and on the right a plate from Ruskin's Stones of Venice, where he compares the Campanile as a majestic monument compared with other less majestic and smaller monuments of medieval periods. The Campanile here rises proud. And it was not until the fall of this republic and the gradual rise of historical studies following Ruskin that the Campanile as a monument became a Campanile considered as a historical monument, one which included in the definition both the original tower and its Renaissance additions. That is, it was only in the 19th century that it became possible to argue with the Daily Telegraph that the past was both above price and beyond recall, that even a faithful copy such as that substituted in 1902 was a desecration of the memory of an object whose value resided totally in the past, its stones alive only because touched by masons once alive but now dead. The past lived in this vision of historical monuments, paradoxically, because it was irretrievably dead. But such an absolutist historicism, while purist in its radical rejection of anachronism, restoration, and copy, nevertheless founded in contradiction and ambiguity when presented with actual monuments of the past, which, while not reduced to piles of rubble, were imminently in danger of such a fate. And we know that the monumental value, the symbolic value of the Campanile was in fact too great to leave the Campanile as a pile of rubble. Working drawings were drawn up, as you see on the right, a much better, much tougher reinforced structure, better technologies. On the left, a very interesting photograph by the designer Fortuny, who was using his new Kodak box camera in Venice in the early 1900s. One of the few photographs we have of the Venice without the monumental presence of the Campanile. And strange it looks on the left. And so there on the left again you see it halfway finished, and on the right breathe a sigh of relief. It's back again, and most tourists who go there probably didn't know it had ever fallen down. A year after the collapse of the Campanile, the curator of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Vienna, the brilliant art historian Alois Riegl, outlined these contradictions in an elegantly argued essay entitled The Modern Cult of Monuments. It was translated in that issue of Oppositions that was edited by Kurt Forster and Diane Girardo, and has since been retranslated in French twice, and both times in French equally badly. So choose your language. The Modern Cult of Monuments of Riegl discriminated between the different values that might be ascribed to a monument of any kind, and the different and often opposed effects of these values on the monument itself. Thus, Riegl noted, the original meaning of a monument was not historical at all, but simply memorial. What he called intentional monuments were works created in order to dedicate and conserve the memory of some action or person. I give you the Arch of Constantine on the right, or Trajan's column on the left, both intentional monuments, not, when they were built, historical monuments. But Riegl also noted that this original sense of monumentality had, in modern times, by which he meant the 19th century, been gradually extended to embrace not only intentional monuments, but also this relatively new category known as historical monuments, formed by 19th century history and historicism. To us, he argued, everything not of today is historical, and each historical event, because of the notion of historical development and progress, seems irreplaceable. Here the concept of a few intentional monuments in the past, memorizing or memorializing things and events, becomes extremely complicated, because potentially historical monuments are infinite in number. Bits of parchment, from the smallest bits of parchment to the largest city, could be conceived of as a historical monument, thus leading to the large dilemma, of course, of preservation. Any historical object was of value in this light because it marked a stage in the development of one domain or another of human activity. And it was in the early 19th century that we see architects themselves turning to monuments that do not have associations with memorializing, that do not have associations with high architecture, but in fact are interesting for their simple existence in history and in the development of relatively low society. Here, Schinkel, two drawings, one a little farmhouse in Sicily on the right, and the back of the Palatine Hill on the left. And you can see in the picture on the left that Schinkel has been looking very carefully at the latest drawings of Leon Krier. Historical monuments, then, could be potentially infinite in number. Almost everything that existed in history, this, all of us, could be interesting because we existed at one time and therefore are historical and are valuable because of that. But competing with historical monuments for attention, and certainly acting as a judgment or screen through which historical monuments have to pass before they become recognizable in certain terms, is another value which Riegl talks about, what he calls artistic value, that value that you give to pieces of architecture, monuments in the past, because you feel that they are invested with a certain aesthetic value. Potentially, of course, artistic value, as Riegl points out, is definitively opposed to historical value. It chooses, it canonizes, it regulates, it organizes thought and about objects in codes and supposedly objectives and absolute standards of taste. We find, for example, if we compare a similar monument considered historically and a similar monument considered artistically, two very different visions of the monument emerge. Here, stone circles in England, Neolithic stone circles. On the right, the stone circle of Avebury, drawn by a 17th century historian interested in mapping the contours of the territory and finding the exact spacing of the stones as they as they sit in the landscape, a very archaeological and historical vision of a stone circle. When an architect gets to this stone circle, however, Inigo Jones, when he got his hands on Stonehenge, tries to prove that something as big and as massive and as important as Stonehenge has to have artistic value, and tries to draw up a plan of Stonehenge as it must have originally been, following all the codes of Vitruvius's ideal aesthetic formula. And so we find that, in fact, if Inigo Jones had attempted to restore Stonehenge, Stonehenge itself would have been completely transformed under a vision that was purely aesthetic in its values. It valued artistic value over historical value. Artistic values, too, applied to the past, also pick out certain monuments and not others. A very celebrated frontispiece to one of the first great histories, universal histories of architecture, published at the beginning of the 19th century by the 18th century antiquarian Serou d'Agincourt, showing the roster of all the great monuments of the past from ancient Greece through to the Pantheon of Rome. A few great tips of culture. And on the left, the result of this artistic value applied definitively to the production of monuments which are both historical and which should have both historical value and artistic value. That wonderful mausoleum the temple built by Canova, the neoclassical sculptor, for his own tomb in celebration of his own genius in the little village of Possagno, just quite close to Bassano di Grappa in the Veneto. Canova actually succeeded in raising the subscription for this temple in his own lifetime from the grateful citizens of his hometown, Possagno, who felt blessed with such a genius in their midst. And one way to get a commission, by the way, and who built this object with the help of a Venetian architect, Selva, attempting to monumentalize the two great stages of Western culture in one monument. It looks, of course, like the Pantheon, but it's not the Pantheon at all. It's actually as exact a reproduction as Canova could get it of the Parthenon, stuck on the front of a cylinder and dome which emulates the Pantheon. So it's a kind of hybrid of High Greece and High Rome jammed together to make two high points of culture, and inside, of course, Canova himself designing his own tomb as a pyramid, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, all wrapped into one, and therefore sealing and authorizing the genius of Canova himself with history monumentally and artistically conceived. This sense of historical value competing with artistic value is complicated again in the case of real old monuments. As Riegl pointed out, there's also the question of age value. That's the value valued by tourists. Oh, look, it's so old. This must have been built in the 50s. Age value, as Riegl said, is not a value in modern works. In a recent creation, the symptoms of degradation do not produce a positive effect, he said, but on the contrary, they displease us. We don't like it when Gauche or Poissy fall down and become ruins. We want them to be modern eternally. On the other hand, from the point of view of someone who loves age value, the aesthetics of the monument depends in the traces of the decomposition of the monument. That is, the forces of nature and of time literally working their hands on the monument itself. I give you Caspar David Friedrich's Abtei in Eichwald of 1809, showing you the way in which he conceives of the ruin of this Gothic fragment, returning to nature, a nature itself ruined in a sublime vision of eternal change and eternal decay. But this process, of course, has its limits, as the city fathers of Venice noticed when they walked around the rubble of the tower. A pile of stones, said Riegl ironically, without form does not suffice to transmit age value to the spectator. There must at least remain a trace of an original form, of an anterior human work, because a pile of stones is only debris, and it's dead and unformed. And so the problem with age value is it works against itself, finally leading to the complete decomposition of the work. And so the careful balance between historical value, artistic value, and age value that is consistently sought in contemporary preservation attempts is a balance of competing forces, each one competing against the other. Historical value to value everything in the past, obviously leading to no obsolescence and nothing being thrown away at all. Artistic value leading to only certain things being valued in the past, and those things changing as tastes in the present change. And age value leading to everything having to look as though it is so old. Riegl complicated the affair by adding two more values that contributed to the idea of the monument in the modern world. The first was what he called use value, which quickly disappears in the case of ruined or dilapidated buildings, and which is the determined enemy of age value. Sometimes use value, a building having a use which is different than its original use, occurs in such a way as to save the building. Here's a paradoxical sight that greeted Ruskin in the 1860s when he went back to Venice to visit one of his favorite campaniles. It was belching smoke. It had become a factory chimney. On the other hand, if it hadn't become a factory chimney, would the campanile have been still standing? Related to age value, related to use value, of eminently modern characteristic, was also newness value. Newness value, which in an age, the modern age, that called for perfectibility and progress, found insufferable all objects which didn't look as though they had just been created. The idea of making a monument look as though it had just been made when the cathedrals were white. Newness value is, as Riegl argued, the determined enemy both of age value and of historical value, especially when the love of the new forces historical monuments to be restored and often reinvented to a supposedly original condition. I give you the poignant example of the Devil's Bridge, the Teufelsbrücke, by Ludwig Persius in the Schlosspark in Wienerker in Berlin, built in 1838, as you see it on the left. There's a very elaborate allegory built in the garden, which referred to the transition from civilization to nature, and the bridge itself starting out as a calculated ruination and going back to nature with this rustic end piece as it forms a continuous promenade allegorically conceived in the garden of Wienerker. I knew that would happen. When in 1932 the city architects of Berlin decided to restore the objects in the park, the architect looked at this bridge and thought, well, it must once have been a wonderful, modern, at least 19th century work of engineering. So they restored it like that to the form that actually it had never, ever taken. Newness value worked on the work itself in order to create something like this. There's a certain amount of discussion in monuments of this kind which have been restored sometimes by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, sometimes by modern restorers as here. What to do with them? Do we then, there's a considerable party in France working to de-restore certain monuments to their original state. One might then argue that one is in de-restoring a restoration, destroying something which after all is an authentic work of the 1930s. It's some of these paradoxes that I would like to give to you in a very brief trajectory through the history of historical monumentality, the history that Riegl himself assumes as he wrote the essay in 1902, The Modern Cult of Monuments, an ironic reference to the idea that monuments, and historical monuments in particular, have become objects of worship to contemporary civilization because of their historical characteristics, which equal the objects of worship of a previous religiously dominated society. We shall talk about that a little bit later in the talk. But just to give you a rough sketch of this emergence of the historical in the idea of the monumental, the obvious fascination for the ruin that emerged in the middle of the 18th century, Piranesi's engravings, Canaletto's capricci, both giving us a fantasy world of fragments juxtaposed and rejuxtaposed, a kind of Baroque sensibility of scenographic ruination, celebrated in Guardi and Robert, Canaletto, and so on and so forth. This turning towards the end of the 18th century into a kind of amazement at the age and size of monuments. We have here the very speaking sketch by Henri Fuseli, which he captions "The artist in despair over the magnitude of antique fragments." On the left, it's a little difficult to imagine the size of such a statue, and there you have a real, probably a poor student of the Académie sent down to Rome, having to measure this thing and then reconstruct what it must have been like and the scale it must have been built at originally, a kind of sublime blowing up in space of the emerging sensibility for a temporal sublime, a sublime of infinite regression and infinite historicity embodied in these monumental fragments, or museums conceived entirely, built up out of the fragments of the past. Here, of course, the wonderful painting in Stuttgart by Gianpaolo Panini, the imaginary gallery of Roman art from the late 1750s, where the actual sky merges with the sky painted behind the paintings of the great Roman buildings, the Colosseum and the arches, with the Laocoon and the great vases of antiquity, all assembled to give a kind of dreamland of ruins, which were gradually to be, in the early 19th century, sorted out in chronology and in authenticity, as this dreamland of ruins becomes the real work of historians of ruins themselves. Or the fashion for these ruins becomes so great in the late 18th century that if you don't have them, you have to build them. On the left, Piranesi's Vedute, the Temple of Vespasian, before it was excavated, and on the right, the rough imitation of this, the Roman ruin in the Schlosspark of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna by Ferdinand von Hohenberg in 1778. Vienna didn't have Roman ruins. Let Vienna have Roman ruins. Or you might, if you're going to build a Roman ruin, make it useful. And so you could build the column base, one of the immense fragments that so amazed the late 18th century students of architecture. Here's François Barbier, the architect building for Racine de Montville in the Désert de Retz in the 1770s, the famous column house. On the outside, a fragment of a temple whose gigantic size could only be imagined if you proportionally extended the columns up and extended them as a hyperstyle or peristyle temple front. You would get an enormous temple, symbolic, of course, of the rebuilding of the temple, those images that were so powerful in Freemasonic mythology at the end of the 18th century. Inside, a nice little high aristocratic maison de campagne with a little spiral stair leading to salon, boudoirs, and all the modern conveniences of life in the country in 1778. This as built on the right, and on the left as it was when I found it a few years ago, being restored to its former ruined state carefully by the Monument Historique of Paris. They restored it so badly that it had to be de-restored, and it is now being in the process of being re-restored to its original ruined state. So you can get it wrong several times before you bring it back to the original. Or, if you don't want to go to the length of actually building the ruin, you certainly have to ask your architect whether or not the building that he's building for you is going to look good in a couple of thousand years to match up with the Roman ruins and how good they looked after 2,000 years. So the Prince of Wales, when he's asking William Chambers for a mausoleum on the left, also asked Chambers to get up a sketch of what it's going to be looking like to the archaeologists of 2,000 years hence. A lot of architects did that in the 18th and early 19th century. John Soane gave a horrifying picture to the trustees of the Bank of England of what would happen if the bank failed and his designs for the Bank of England in London became like the Roman Fora, but comfortingly enough built the rooms themselves as if, and depicted through these wonderful drawings of Gandhi, built them as if they were parts of a ruined Roman Fora. It's my advice to you, if any of you are going to be clients, not to worry about the 2,000 year mark, but to ask your architect for a sketch of what it's going to look like in 5 years. Or you could do both. You could be both useful and playful at the same time. This is an extraordinary work on the Peacock Island, or Pfaueninsel in Berlin, by the royal scene painter, they say, but in my book it's the only known collaboration between Michael Graves and Charles Gwathmey. It has a kind of Gravesian front and a kind of cubic Gwathmey back, and of course it's white, which must mean it comes from Graves' early period. You can, but there's a little trompe-l'oeil there. You can see in the little portcullis nicely showing the peacocks walking around on their island. This was actually built for the habitation of those royal mistresses who were inconvenient in the corridors of the palace in the center city, also occupied by the Queen, of course. There, you can see on the right the Tahiti room in the round turret of that, and painted not only the bamboo in trompe-l'oeil, but also the windows. It was very dreary and gray in Berlin in the 1780s, I'm sure. The windows of this Tahiti room as if we were looking out on Tahiti itself. And then on the left, also on the Pfaueninsel, we have a complete reproduction down to every crack and cranny, measured by a very willing architectural student, sent to Rome to get the exact dimensions of the ruin of the fountain of Marcellus in the Forum of Marcellus in Rome. It'd be very interesting to go back now and see how both have aged over the last 100 years and see which one makes the better ruin. But these ruins, of course, in the early 19th century, being subjected to more than antiquarian and playful and exotic fantasies, they become, of course, objects of the high sublime. And in fact, you could write the history of historicism as applied to monuments in the 19th century as a history of the rise and fall of the monumental sublime, starting in the early Romantic period with a sense of gigantism, of power, of monuments resisting time, falling with time, entering into play with the elements. Here, of course, the Turner drawing of Stonehenge in a thunderstorm, and on the right, William Blake's drawing of two of the columns of Stonehenge as a kind of originary architecture. Out of this were fashioned many images. In America, we have the Hudson River Valley School of Painting, Cole, with his vision of the rise and fall of empires, architecturally and scenographically illustrated according to the concepts of a sublime that is at once spatial, it's gigantic, and historical, it's infinitely recessive and so old you can't bear it. Now, in terms of the transformation of this general sense of the sublime into a sense of more scholarly history, one of the decisive moments took place, paradoxically enough, at the time of the French Revolution, between the period 1793 and 1805, a time, of course, when the monuments of France, the historical monuments of France, were being subjected to increasing vandalism, a word which was in fact coined during this period by a defender of historical monuments, the Abbé Grégoire, vandalism because they represented the signs of the old feudal regime, the Ancien Regime, and all the tyrannies that went with it, the dispossession of the chateau, the looting of their contents, the turning over many chateaux to being stone quarries, the demolition of convents and churches, the desecration of tombs, and so on and so forth, being a well-tabulated and well-orchestrated part of revolutionary activity and revolutionary politics, at least between 1789 and 1795. Someone who resisted this tendency, or at least profited from it, was a young artist called Alexandre Lanois, who established on the site of what is now the old École des Beaux-Arts on the left bank in Paris, a museum of French monuments, the first museum chronologically to display the historical monuments of France in order, age by age, epoch by epoch, style by style. It was Lanois' job, installed in the old convent of the Augustins, part of which still exists today. This is a site plan which shows you both the convent of the Augustins and the later 1830 to 50 editions of the École des Beaux-Arts of the later 19th century. Lanois was put in charge of this dispossessed convent in order to receive the debris, the tomb sculptures, the valuables, the bits and pieces of antiquity which had been ransacked, parts of private collections which had been brought to Paris by revolutionary administrations, and to basically stockpile them in this convent until they were needed as stone for building or as valuables to sell off and help the war effort. Instead, Lanois used the rooms of the convent. Each room he dedicated to a century, and each century he illustrated with objects more or less coming from that century, tomb sculptures, architectural fragments, and so on and so forth. Where he couldn't find, he invented and got architects to build elaborate mise-en-scène in each of the rooms, and you could literally walk round from the entrance right there, which is this entrance. He found and had transported to Paris one of the facades of the Chateau of Annay near Paris, which was in imminent danger of being demolished by the revolutionary administration, placed it as an entrance to the old church of the Augustins. When you entered the old monastery, you came into a first room which showed a whole range of monuments from Egyptian times. There's an obelisk in the back there, through to present time. There were 18th and early 19th century busts and sculptures in this room, a kind of panorama of the chronology that you were then going to find. And then you moved room by room, here the 13th century room, in a style completely invented by Lanois, not such a great historical scholar at the time. He thought, together with many scholars, that the Gothic came from Syria, and when Napoleon came into this room, he apparently clapped Lanois on the back and said, Lanois, vous avez me transporté à Syrie. You've transported me to Syria, which showed that Napoleon's historical knowledge was just as bad as Lanois'. But the idea of this mise-en-scène was extremely innovative at the time. It was a way of showing the actual objects of the century in the environment of the century. And so as you walked room by room, you literally had a succession of the ages presented to you. You could walk the chronology of history, as the great French Romantic historian Jules Michelet once said, as he was taken hand in hand by his mother as a child through this Musée des Monuments Français. He said, this is where I learned the great chronology of the epochs, of the ages, and what the ages themselves thought of themselves. Because you could stand, and it was encouraged in the guidebook that Lanois wrote and revised several times for the visitors to this museum. You were encouraged to stand and meditate upon the nature of the age which had produced the arch. So the 13th century room, the 14th century room, the cloister, which scrambles together a few ages so as to get to the 17th century room. And then when you're finished meditating on the chronology of the ages as given to you by Lanois, you debouched into the garden, and the garden itself he called an Elysée, or an Elysium, and in it he manufactured a whole series of tombs which he dedicated to the famous intellectuals, scholars, political figures, and makers of the French nation. Where he could get their actual remains, he took them from the tombs where they were buried and buried them in his new tombs. Where he couldn't, he asked you to imagine that they were buried there. A particularly interesting tomb on the right for the, this was a wonderful spot for the early 19th century French tourists, because it was the fake-up tomb that Lanois designed for the two romantic lovers, Abelard and Héloïse. And he claimed inside this tomb base were actually the remains of Abelard and Héloïse. Although when I looked at the records, I found not all of Héloïse was there, because Héloïse was kept, or part of her at least. The skull was given to the sculptor who actually carved her lifelike bust on the tomb itself, and then was lost. And most of her arms were kept out by Lanois, who delighted in giving bits of Héloïse away after elaborate dinner parties. It was almost like a kind of cult. The culture minister, the Minister of Culture in 1812, 1813 was very happy to receive Héloïse's index finger after an elaborate supper, a kind of monumental necrophilia which begins to affect the rest of the century. A little footnote to this you can actually go and see here in Père Lachaise Cemetery. You can actually, this was moved after the demolition of the Musée des Monuments Français, moved to Père Lachaise, and you can go and actually meditate in front of this thing, which was got up out of bits of old and bits of new. It was one of the first, in fact, mélanges which one could characterize as thoroughly postmodern in its conception and its organization. A footnote to that is this, which was of course the facade that Lanois had brought to the front courtyard of the Musée des Monuments Français and was erected. It was a facade of the Château de Gaillon, one of the great Renaissance chateaux of France, which when Dubin, the architect of the École the Palais des Études of the École des Beaux-Arts, when he started to lay out the plan of the Beaux-Arts, he used it as a kind of monumental set piece through which to enter, or at least hypothetically, to enter the, I wonder if I can find that plan. To enter the École des Beaux-Arts, you can see there's the front courtyard of the Musée des Monuments Français, the little Arc de Gaillon, which was kept as a centerpiece, which finally was completed by the Hémicycle with its great historical paintings by Paul Delaroche. And so from real history to Beaux-Arts history, you have the connection being made in a very romantic stage-by-stage metaphor across the site, which was taken by the École des Beaux-Arts after the Musée des Monuments Historiques was closed in 1815, 1816. I was walking past the site of the École des Beaux-Arts a couple of years ago, and I'd always been very happy to wander through, and I was with an architect friend of mine, Antoine Grumbach, and we happened to look to the left as we were walking down the Rue Bonaparte, and this wasn't there anymore. It had been apparently taken by the order of the Ministry of Historical Monuments back to the Chateau of Gaillon, which was in the process of being restored. The debate, which I then had with Antoine Grumbach, and which is an interminable debate, of course, is, should therefore a replica be restored on the site? Because after all, you are now taking this away, you're taking away the frontispiece of a very fine work of the 19th century. The French, however, do not yet categorize 19th century monuments very easily. It's a great struggle to get a 19th century monument categorized as historical, and so it will only be in another 2 or 3 centuries when the Chateau de Gaillon will be demolished in order to bring this back to this site in order to revalue the Palais des Études of the École des Beaux-Arts. Until then, you have to go to Gaillon to see it. Or in the, I think I'm going to, no. Another kind of museum, a much more private museum, the very celebrated museum of which John Soane built in the period between the late 1790s and the early 1830s in 3 adjoining houses in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The section of the 2 stories of museum, or 3 stories of museum across the back of those 3 houses, an almost chronological interest in the setting in the basement of those things which could be called crypt-like, an Egyptian sarcophagus, a monk's parlor, bits and pieces of very primitive sculpture, and moving up through this great shaft, which is called the dome, to busts of antique heroes and Greek civilization. Here is one of the original renderings of the walk through the little rooms, each one encrusted with elements of history, some plaster casts, some original, some boosted in scale, some reduced in scale, in order to give this almost a sense of a kind of vertical and horizontal archaeology a la Piranesi to the sense of visiting John Soane's own house, a house for an architect who bases his inventions on history, surrounding himself literally with the fragments of the past. Here the sarcophagus in the bottom of the dome, the Egyptian room, and here a wonderful little monument, a little bit like Lanois. Soane loves to make monuments. One of the most elegant compositions of his life was the monuments he built for his wife. But here is a very extraordinary little monument in the basement, made out of bits of medieval, bits of antique, casts of antique, another bit of medieval, and a bit of John Soane in the middle and round the bottom. This is a monument in the memory of his favorite dog. And then a little later in the historical development of historical philology and of historicism, a sense of history itself building the modern world with a kind of powerful investment in the monumentality of the state. And we know, and this is something I'm going to talk about in much greater detail when I talk to Margaret Crawford's class on Schinkel on Friday. Here, the Altes Museum, the then Neue Museum of Schinkel, where bits of architectural monumentality are brought much in the same way as Canova monumentalized himself, now the monumentalizing of the history of Western civilization, with the Stoa laid into the replicated plan of the royal palace. The fronting of the historical museum against the royal palace was, of course, a cultural act in its own right, and embedding in something which is entered publicly by a Stoa and chronologically routed through a whole series of rooms for the exhibition of schools of painting and objects embedded in the center, a pantheon-like room, so that the height of Greece, the secular vision of Greece is balanced by the pantheonization of Rome, Greece allowing entrance and exit to and from the modern city, and Rome allowing a kind of atemporalization of the most important works of art in the collection in the center. The plan itself embodying the coming together of historical value, historical monumental value, and artistic value that we described was so crucial to Riegl. Or Schinkel, in another vein, in the farmhouse on the bailiff's house on the Faunsinsel, another little folly built by Schinkel, but here inserting in the fabric of an old farmhouse a piece of original late Gothic civil architecture from a merchant's house in Danzig. The original, then all the rest got up by Schinkel in a style that he invented from the original. An interesting little moment in preservation history when Danzig asked after the war for this to be given back to Danzig, because they were in the process of restoring the merchant street of Danzig, leading to the possibility that the authorities in Berlin would have to fake up one of this facade, thus making Schinkel's imitation of the original of which this facade would have then been an imitation. One of the paradoxes of restoration. Paradoxes which were most extensively demonstrated in the 19th century in the various projects for the restoration of statues. Here we can focus on something, the human body, that we all know very well. Casimir de Cancy had the idea that architecture was easy to restore because it was additive, and if you have one column, you could restore a whole building. I had that argument with another friend of mine, Dimitri Porphyrios, a Greek living in London, when he finally persuaded me to go onto the Acropolis with him. And on the Acropolis, we had the argument. Dimitri, a follower of Leon Krier, or a friend of Leon Krier, wanted to restore the entire Acropolis to its original state as it was. And I said, but which period would you restore? Would you restore the Parthenon? Would you restore the Parthenon? Would you add the church? Would you add the little mosque? Would you add the minarets? What period? He said, oh, the high period, of course. And then I said, well, if you're going to do it, I'll give you can do it, because he accused me of being a nostalgic lover of ruins for their own sake, and I wasn't going to give in to that. I said, okay, well, if you build it again, you're going to have to paint it in all those garish colors that you know damn well it was painted in. He said, no, it's got to be white. And I knew artistic value was ruling historical value in his mind, and I was much less nostalgic than he was. Casimir de Cancy then, starting this movement, from Casimir de Cancy to Leon Krier is a very short step. Casimir de Cancy starting this movement. Architecture is easy, sculpture is harder, because there are so many possibilities in sculpture and so many nuances. A plate showing from two plates from Casimir de Cancy's Jupiter Olympian, how you restore the statues of the Olympian Jupiter, and ivory statues and their techniques of making in antiquity. A little anecdote already recounted many times with great glee by Kurt Forster. The sculptures, the temple sculptures of Aegina, brought to Munich, restored by Thorvaldsen, the late neoclassical sculptor, in such a way that they were completed, so that as you came into the Glyptothek, you could actually see the completed sculptures as they must have been in their original. And then in the 60s, a frenzy of de-restoration, cutting off all the bits that Thorvaldsen added, leaving the quote-unquote authentic and original bits. And what they did with Thorvaldsen's original bits, I don't know, but it was a destruction of an extraordinary mise-en-scène of late neoclassicism. Or what they didn't do but might have done, to this this sculpture, the very famous Venus de Milo, found in 1820, immediately assumed, even before it got back to Paris, Quatremère de Cancy promised to give it to Louis XVIII as an original statue by Praxiteles. It came back to Paris like this. You can see it came back to Paris a little more complete than you see it now in the Louvre. It had a bit of an arm, and it also had a base. But the problem with the base for Quatremère de Cancy and the scholars is that the base had the signature of the sculptor on it, and the sculptor's name was Agasandros, not Praxiteles. So this base was very quickly and conveniently lost and has not been found, and the sculpture was presented to Louis XVIII as a genuine sculpture of Praxiteles, or, as Quatremère de Cancy said, if not by him, by his son. Quatremère de Cancy also lost this piece of arm, because I think the kind of torso aesthetic of the early 19th century was such that the idea of Venus having a stump and not a torso was not at all aesthetically correct. But then the fun started, because what to do, how to restore this statue, and believe me, if they could have agreed on it, they would have done it. Quatremère de Cancy, in several studies on the right, wanted to restore it to its original state. He thought that Venus was appeasing Mars, the god of war. The philosopher Ravesson and curator of the Louvre after Quatremère thought it wasn't appeasing Mars. Curator of the Louvre after Quatremère thought it wasn't appeasing Mars, the god of war, but that Venus and Ares were in fact a happy married couple. Others thought that I'm sorry, I can't get this right now. No, I've got to go back here to that one, and then I've got to go forward to that one. Right. Others thought that as Venus, she might have been holding a mirror, as you can see there, or a spear. She might have been, that's Kiel's restoration on the right. Here, Mélangin is giving her a shield, and then the English, much influenced by Mérimée and the Carmen myth, gives her a kind of castanets and gives her sort of makes her a sort of dancing lady. Then that's John Bell, and then Valentin imagines her quarreling with Mars, and Furtwängler imagines her completely differently, holding an apple and leaning on a column. Surely Frankenstein had it easier than the archaeologists in this respect. But the archaeologists tried very hard, and they tried very hard not only on statues but on buildings. Here's the Acropolis as it was found with all its stages of development in the late 18th century, depicted by Stuart and Rivette and David Leroy between the late 1750s and the early 1780s. The Acropolis, which became itself so much an object of inspiration and inquiry. The David Leroy trying to make symmetrical and very neoclassical, for example, in this ideal restoration of the propylaea, as it must have been in this in 1758. Here, the Parthenon with the little mosque that I suggested to Dimitri Porphyrius should be built inside the Parthenon if you're going to be accurate about building the thing as it was through more than one stage of history. And here, of course, is von Klenze taking inspiration in his own architecture, but also proposing on the liberation of Greece to build a new palace for the newly reinstalled kings of Greece in the Propylaean Parthenon with the statue of Athena, the Erection, all built exactly as they must have been in this golden image of the early 1830s. Or Schinkel, who does very much the same thing, except that he does at least maintain the ruins as a kind of field of history. He straightens them out a bit in order to work on his axes. Here we're improving a little bit on Greek surveying methods. And so you have the Propylaea and the Parthenon literally restored to their ruined state, and then behind a little bit of Schinkel's muscle flexing as he builds a palace for the king of the Greeks out of a very extraordinary style, half Oriental, half Roman, with a bit of Baalbek and Greece and wooden medieval thrown in, with courtyard after courtyard of these grand palaces. Quite serious propositions for building on the Acropolis. At least they had no sense of inferiority in front of Greek ruins. Now, the thing that's not happening is that. Oh, that's right. Or Viollet-le-Duc, who, of all the great architect and restorers of the 19th century, as you know, actually managed to do things to objects in rather deliberate and drastic way. Here is the Chateau of Pierrefonds for the early Romantic period, a place where poets used to go and meditate among the ruins of a medieval past. Viollet-le-Duc's sketches of Pierrefonds, his sketches of Pierrefonds as it must have looked like in the Middle Ages, and no one knew better than Viollet-le-Duc how the Middle Ages must have looked. His elevations and the aerial perspective here. It was in Pierrefonds, of course, where the court of Napoleon III and Josephine used to repair. It was like a kind of maison secondaire, a kind of weekend place. You got away from the hustle and bustle of Paris, and you came to Pierrefonds and had medieval banquets. That's Pierrefonds actually finished by Viollet-le-Duc for the emperor. And here's Josephine's bedroom, all got out by Viollet-le-Duc in medieval dress. Viollet even designed medieval dresses for the entire court. The sort of bankers and bureaucrats suffered most in the chain mail at weekends. And then Viollet-le-Duc even designed the menus and was even known to have a hand in the kitchen, and that disturbed the court even more. It was more of a duty than a pleasure to be invited to Pierrefonds for the weekend. But it was working on this restoration that gave Viollet-le-Duc his vision of what restoration was. And in his article "Restoration" in the great Rational Dictionnaire Raisonné of the 1850s, he wrote, "To restore a building is not to maintain it, not to repair it, not to rebuild it. It is to reestablish in a complete state what never could have existed at any given moment before." That he did at Pierrefonds. And then if you really want Disney World, you go to Carcassonne, which used to look like that, and now looks, if you can get to it from the parking lot, like this. And if you go through these, if you dare to go through these monumental battlements completely rebuilt by Viollet-le-Duc, you find a complete replica of a medieval city with medieval tourists and medieval food and medieval postcards and so on and so forth. All ready to be bought so you can take it back to the car and take it home. This also happened, much to Ruskin's dismay, in Venice itself. He found his drawings of Byzantine and Gothic palaces being used by the local architect-restorer Meduna to completely remake and restore. For example, here the Fondaco dei Turchi, and as he visited this, he was heard to say that it was impossible now to find a single ancient stone in it. What had been an attractive ruin, something which in some way to Ruskin marked the stages of the decline of Venice, now in its 19th century mass-produced air, had lost its aura. And of course, the debate between this and this is a debate which is continuing today. But it got much more heated when it became applied literally to the facade of St. Mark's, which admittedly in this photograph you can see in the 1850s and 60s was decaying very seriously. One of Ruskin's drawings of the different colored marbles on the northwest corner of St. Mark's, a photograph before the restoration. Meduna, who started to restore using modern techniques of cutting marble, which themselves very quickly, as Ruskin predicted, deteriorated much more rapidly than the original techniques of grinding and polishing in the Byzantine era had done. There was an extraordinary outcry about the restoration of the front of St. Mark's, aided by Ruskin and the amateur historian Zorzi, and it was feared that something like this was going to happen, that in fact the entire Byzantine front of St. Mark's was going to be scraped off in order to give the world an authentic view of what St. Mark's must have looked like at its origins, at its first building. And in the Architect and Building News of December 5th, 1879, a very amusing short story parodying this restoration in progress, which fortunately was stopped before it destroyed the entire front of St. Mark's. In 1882, a decree was announced by the Venetian government to preserve rather than to restore. And in this story, which features an amateur archaeologist and a Cockney tourist, I have to read it to you in the original Cockney, of course, the different positions on restoration are made very clear. "Ah," he said, "it ain't so with St. Mark's. I asked him who he was." Those of you would like a translation afterwards of it. "I asked him who he was. He said he was an amateur archaeologist of long standing and he wanted to sit down. I inquired if he thought the past ought to be restored. He said he wouldn't touch it so long as it could hang together. We are the custodians of the past," he said. "We've no workman good enough to replace it, nor clever enough to repair it. And as for colour, look at St. Mark's front, which they wanted to do something to give future ages a chance of looking at it. Restore it? Bah! John Ruskin's the man for my money. He says, don't alter a stone. Keep on drawing till it falls." He's right. How'd you like to have your front restored if you were St. Mark's? He said, turning suddenly towards me. I leave you with some images which time does not allow me to enter completely, and perhaps my professional reputation would be enhanced by not entering into the images so completely. I start with the picture of the restoration of tourism, that is the touristic sublime. I have to, the Austrian writer Karl Kraus, that wonderful friend of Adolf Loos, an ironist, said of tourism, said, I leave it to those who travel to participate in the cult of grandiose natural scenery, leaving it to the detestable tourist to get what they can out of the high mountains and the historical monuments. And so this is what the detestable tourists see when they go to Pompeii, the original Pompeii, and in a book what it must have looked like in its origins. And believe me that throughout the 19th century, from Chateaubriand on, there were real and serious projects for restoring Pompeii to its original former state. There have been projects in the present to restore the past to us, and I leave you with some of these double images, images of a past where historical monuments were at least considered sublime. It is funny, isn't it, the way in which All books on the Sublime, from Burke to Kant through Hegel, talk about the sublime and the ridiculous as being two faces of the same coin. Or the original playful exoticism, and now we have it in the tourist office itself. Or, coming closer to home, so to speak, we have one of the slides I used to be very fond of showing in Princeton, and it's quite obvious why. As you see on the right, I don't show it anymore. A historical monument which I used to be very fond of looking at, and now I don't visit anymore because it's been spoiled for me. Or an entrance to the Turner Gallery, which obviously is inflected by images of the Turnerian and the Bouleyan Sublime. Boulet on the left, Jim Sterling on the right. Here, Boulet's entrance to the catacombs of an Egyptian cemetery. Here, Jim Sterling's more reassuring image of the catacomb entering into an art gallery, and you can be reassured because, unlike Boulet, he gives you a little red revolving door. It goes both ways. Don't have so much fear of death in the post-modern Sublime. You can come out of it. Or in this extraordinary image of Boulet, where he invents what he calls a negative architecture, an architecture which is entirely inflected in shadows, where the actual architectural orders are made by cutting out in what Boulet specifies to be a light-absorbent stone, so that the figure of the temple is cut into the surface of this black rock, so that the temple of death itself is, in fact, a negative temple. You draw your own conclusions as to the horror and the terror embodied in the image on the right. Or the pyramid again. The French were obsessed, and still are obviously, with pyramids. But now again, instead of being solid and entombing, it's sort of light and reassuring. And you could even, as the architect presented it in Paris, you could even, if you don't like it in a few years, dismantle it. And I leave you, I guess, with this question of authenticity. If the one on the left is authentic, is the one on the right? And if the one on the right is authentic, is the one on the left? And I think I've given you some sense of my own puzzle as to the dilemma and paradox of history and the burden that we bear. Thank you very much. I don't have many answers to problems which I have to give back to you as the architects, but I'm going to be turning up at a jury tomorrow afternoon, so I'll be able to say what I feel about contemporary production then. Right, Ron? Right. If there are any questions, I'd love to answer them informally. Oh, should we have formal questions? Is it normal to have formal questions?
If there are.
Fine. Formal questions.
As a professor of classics, I feel you've come to tell me the story of my life here. So I've been trying to think a little more about the motives that were evoked a bit in the beginning, in the quote from Nietzsche, and all along. At first, I thought when you spoke of the historicity of this, and that this is really an invention of the modern period, and it's not another time. Immediately I thought, oh, well, that's not true, and let me see if I can think of some counterexamples of how Rome thought about early Greece.
Oh, yes, and we've all had nostalgia all the time.
That's
and
right,
yes.
and then I more and more thought, well, he's right, he's really right. And so I wanted to know why that's true.
Why am I right?
Well, I'm for the moment saying that you are, and I'm trying to think about why it is that that this happens now and it didn't then.
Because
and I thought a bit about some distances only in time.
right.
But I'd like to see if you would want to speculate a little bit more on some psychosocial determinants of this last couple of centuries or so that make us use the past with this problematical combination of history, art, and age working all together in a way that late Rowan Williams about Greece,
Right.
about its early period.
Right. Well, I think I've obviously given that enormous amount of thought, because it's quite obvious that one could certainly find everything or some of the things I've talked about in the Renaissance, and certainly Alberti exhibits as powerful a nostalgia of things lost as historicist in the 19th century. I think that, very shortly, very briefly, I think the question comes down to the difference between architecture, which is based on a tradition, as opposed to architecture which is based on a history. And I think that before architecture had a history, it had a tradition, and its forms and its techniques, whether they be Greek, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or medieval, they were based on the transmission of knowledge and the building of objects in a very different manner, in a very different kind of conception of the relationship of building to object than emerged in the modern pre-industrial and industrial period. And I think the invention of something to look like something else, like the the invention of a historical facade that looks like the past, but which cannot in any way be fabricated in the same way as the past, is one of the big disjunctions, one of the big cutting points of the culture of architecture, certainly.
So it has to do with the invention of the printing press and photographs and that sort of thing, that we didn't have in Augustan Rome. We didn't have photographs. That's how.
I suppose that's true, yes, but also to do with the fact that if you're basing your building on a drawing of another building which you haven't seen, as opposed to basing your building on the building that you trained as a mason, on the site of which you trained as a mason, it's a very different relationship. It's a very different cultural relationship, I think. And I'm not nostalgic for, I'm not like Leon Krier, nostalgic for Mason culture. I think it was sort of nasty, brutish, and short. And if any of you have read the recent novel by Peter Susskind called Perfume, it was also very smelly. And but I think there was a certain break. First, I think it was very, very much evident in the Renaissance, and I think it was just very much exacerbated in the 19th century.
But you admit that there was a kind of combination, restoration, put together.
Absolutely, and there have been infinite revivals too. Yes, yes. Now, and in a funny way, in a kind of way, I'm not claiming primacy for the modern period. I'm not saying, in fact, this is the first nostalgia, this is the first loss of aura, this is the first revivalist period, this is, I'm not being a Walter Benjamin and saying everything until the cast iron was one way and we've lost it, and now we're this way and we have to mourn. I'm not being like that. I'm simply trying to look at the roots of our own historicisms. And what I find very interesting is that the historical objects that postmodernism generally looks to are themselves the products of the first sort of generation of artificial classicism. I mean, it's neoclassicism that postmodern looks to much more than it is classicism. I mean, the images I showed were all based on 18th century and early 19th century images. So that in a sense, one can see them as part of the same culture. Except some things happen twice. What was it? All things happen twice. Some things is tragedy, and some things is second time is farce. But I agree with you absolutely, and I think if you, I mean, Peter Brown has found the same thing in the late Middle Ages, and it's endless. Nostalgia is obviously endless.
I really wanted to know if you thought of some other than architectural motives or determinants for this kind of thing, because we're really talking about the whole
Yes.
notion of modernism in
Right,
a way.
right.
So I gather,
Right.
when you invoke the sublime and the romantic
Yes.
and so forth, the etiology of this is much more.
Well, I think I would argue that the redefinition of the sublime with Burke and then Kant is a decisive turn in aesthetic understanding. I do think that. I think that the need to transform what was simply a high genre into something which identified qualities which weren't aesthetic before in a whole range of objects and in sensations. Something which aestheticized the landscape in a particular way, something which aestheticized bad things as well as good things in a certain way. I think that was I do think the sublime is a characteristic mode of thought, and I do think there is something called the postmodern sublime. Although I disagree with Lyotard in the way he frames it. What's that?
There is such a thing we are.
Yes, I think so. I'm feeling a bit ruined having just got off the plane. So if I can recuperate my age value with a drink, I'd be very happy.